So welcome to this afternoon session, Electric Dreams, Cars and the Future of Transport. Clearly it's a really topical discussion, this. I'm sure travel will definitely be on the agenda for that other conference happening, COP26. In the budget, there was quite a few travel issues. The fuel duty rise cancelled, £7 billion for transport in the regions, air passenger duty up for long-haul flights and down for domestic flights. So there's lots of issues in the news at the moment on this particular topic. My name's Hilary Salt. I'm going to be chairing this session, which means making sure the speakers stick to time and then getting out to hear from you. As with all the sessions here, it's you we want to hear from. So please be thinking of points and challenges and questions you want to raise in that session. As with the other sessions, I'll come out, take a few contributions, come back to the panel, come out again. And we will hopefully get a good range of contributions. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel. I'm really, really delighted that they've all joined us today. If you look on the website, they've all got really long biographies, which I'm not going to read out because you want to hear from them and we want to hear from you. So I'll give them a very brief introduction in the order in which they'll speak. So Edwina Curry, I think most people will have met already in the first session today. Very pleased to welcome her. As people will remember, she had a long political career, served in government at the then Department of Health. Is now an accomplished author, TV personality, on her way, I think, to becoming a national treasure. So welcome, Edwina. And I think a fellow Tesla owner. Yes? Yeah. Tesla girls, I thought we should have called this session. So, Edwina, welcome. And then next speaking will be Nigel Ruddock. Nigel's an accountant and business restructure expert. He was previously head of automotive services and chairman at Grant Thornton. He had retired, but then he dusted off his boots and has now gone back to work as the CFO at Technology Minerals, who do cobalt mining, but they are also a big investor in a new technology for recycling lithium and lead for batteries. So I'm sure he'll have some great things to bring to the table today. And then finally we have Dr. Norman Lewis, an expert on future trends in technology innovation, previously a director at PwC, running their crowdsourced innovation programme, the Chief Innovation Officer at Open Knowledge, and he's had a host of other exciting positions. He's now a director at Future Diagnosis Limited and is the co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. London's generally got a boo today, so I don't know why it didn't that time. But anyway, we're obviously a bit more cosmopolitan in the room. And a national treasure, another national treasure. So can we welcome our panel, please? Thank you. So I'm going to ask them to speak for something like 5 to 7 minutes, and then I will get them to stop talking, and we will move on. So Edwina, opening thoughts, please.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a Tesla owner. In fact, I'm on my second Tesla. I love it. So I'm here mainly to speak as an enthusiast, as a customer, a consumer, and obviously since my family have had Teslas since 2017, the point at which, in fact, only I think 70,000 Tesla cars are being produced. We were well ahead of the curve. I try and be very green. I've had solar panels since 1983, LED lights, recycling, turn the thermostats down. It's a bit cold downstairs. And I'm old enough to remember when the Clean Air Act came in, and one of the real tragedies that we were facing and trying to deal with was the effects of wholesale pollution, particularly on our cities, and how extraordinary it was. It took about 10 years before we actually began to see clean air. I entered Parliament in 1983, which was point at which we got solar panels put on the first house and so on. And very pleased to see Margaret Thatcher really got on board with climate change and spoke about it first at the Royal Society and then at the United Nations. And we are talking well over 30 years ago. And everybody thought she was crackers. They really thought it was evidence that Margaret was losing her marbles. I mean, I think she was losing her marbles by that point, but that wasn't the evidence. Where are we now? Well, it's good to see that actually global warming, which is what Margaret called it, rather than climate change. Climate change implies it could go either way, that it could be positive or beneficial or negative or not. But global warming says maybe this is changing the whole world, the whole planet, and maybe it's not a good thing, so it has a different kind of connotation. But I think it's widely accepted, though we have heard voices even today suggesting that it's being exaggerated. I don't think it's being exaggerated. I think it's a matter of considerable concern and that action needs to be taken both through carrots and sticks, both through government action and through individual action. And we're seeing a lot more of it and we're going to have to get used to it. The topic today is electric cars and electric vehicles. Of course, H2, hydrogen, is also a clean alternative depending on how it is produced. And I suspect what we're going to find over the next few years is that changing the internal combustion engine to have clean fuels is going to be not a rival but a complement to having electric vehicles fueled through batteries. We're going to see both, and they will have their role to play depending on whether you have weight as a significant factor, as it would be for a plane where you might go more likely for H2, or whether weight is going to be fine, in which case a JCB may be more likely to be done on batteries. And there's no clear view on that. That's going to depend, I think, on the way that the markets actually work. But what I have found is if you're going to have an electric car and have pleasure from it, it really does need a different mindset. It needs a mindset that plans your journey ahead. It's actually quite similar to 20 odd years ago when I used to drive a lot in France. France is a huge country, didn't have many petrol stations. They were shut on Sundays, so heaven help you if you came off the ferry on Saturday evening and had 400 miles to go. You had to plan your journey. And that's how it's been with a Tesla. In the first couple of years that I owned one, now it's getting much easier. And the cars have improved dramatically. I've got one now with double batteries, so it'll do 350 miles for a £5, which is much nicer than having an equivalent car that would do it on God knows how much it's costing. Now, I don't even need to notice what that petrol price is or the fuel price is. And there are other elements to it as well. The different mindset is it ain't all going to be about cars in future. It's going to be about public transport. It's going to be about, for example, an area like this, improving public transport. One of the hot issues in this area is HS3, and we look to see how we are going to improve relationships between the big cities of the north. It could be about cycling, but to be honest, it's so hilly round here. And you get to my age that cycling is really probably not an option, but it might be for you too, you're younger. And it's also about opportunities, I think, that present themselves for business. We tend to see all change in negative ways in this country, which I think, Hilary, is a shame. Yes, there would be a downside for some operations, but I see no reason why fuel stations in the future shouldn't be places where we all just plug in and either get a shot of H2 or we get a shot of electricity or whatever. It's going to be a very interesting way to see how that comes. The changeover, the technology of all this is so similar to nearly 200 years ago as the steam engine came in with railways. Between 1830 and 1845-46, there was a revolution in this country. It happened extremely fast. It made some people an enormous amount of money, including the Stevensons, and it certainly changed the way that we travel all over the world. I think that's what's happening right now, and I'm very pleased that Elon Musk, who I think is a flawed genius, but a genius, is actually doing very well out of it.
Thank you, that's great, thank you, and spot on time as well. I've just got a new charging station opened up in an old garage in Manchester with a Greggs in it. That's my kind of shot that you're stopping for. Nigel.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. Well, look, this is it's a vast topic, so I'm just going to focus on electric vehicles and just throw a few ideas out and perhaps then see where we go. But there's a lot that strains from this. Electric vehicles, there's an awful lot of talk about charging points and range anxiety and all the rest of it. Forget it. This is an early start-up of this technology, and the problem will get solved. Batteries will get smaller, they'll get lighter, they'll have higher capacity, and crucially, they will also get cheaper. And more charging points will be developed. So the problem will be solved. And why do I say that? Well, there is massive amount of R&D going into this area globally. VW alone last year spent $16 billion on R&D on electric vehicles, and all the other manufacturers are spending similar amounts. They are literally betting the farm on getting this technology right. And it's interesting because the capital markets have noticed. So on Wednesday, VW had a market value of $123 billion. So that's pretty substantial. But on the back of doing a deal for 100,000 hire cars sales to Hertz, which in automotive terms is nothing, Tesla's value soared by 20%. They now have a market cap of over $1 trillion. Facebook is only valued at $880 billion. This is a company that's only made a profit in 1 year of its existence, and that was largely propped up by regulatory trading and Bitcoin. It's mad. Elon Musk's shareholding in Tesla is now worth more than ExxonMobil. So we've got this crazy mix that's going on. But this tells the competitors what they've got to do. It tells VW what they've got to do. They've got to get out of petrol and diesel and get into electric vehicles, because that's where the money is. But I think we need to get some perspective in this. Last year, electric vehicles, 3 million globally. Total global car sales were closer to 70 million units. And overall, in the US, there's about 280 million cars out there. So I think although electric vehicles are clearly here to stay and they're making some good progress, and I think the sales will grow very rapidly, they've still got an awful long way to go before they really challenge the dominance of the internal combustion engine. But there will be some very big consequences that come from this. And I think the first thing you've got to do is really think that an electric vehicle is assembled rather than manufactured. The software is very complex. The design is very innovative. But actually the rest of the vehicle is pretty straightforward in automotive terms. And there are far fewer moving parts. And those parts are largely commoditized. So if you think of the battery, which will probably be made in China by someone like Cattles, it's bought over and it's a box. But that box basically replaces the very complex, very highly precision engineered engine, the gearbox, the drivetrain, the exhaust system. All of that goes, and it's just replaced by one box. And of course, there are very, very well-paid jobs that sit behind all that technology that has just been abandoned. And there's a big cultural issue, I think, that comes with this. Mercedes and BMW and the rest, they're being forced by regulation, and this is a really interesting case of regulation driving innovation. They're being asked to change their power source. Now, their DNA is engineering. That's what they do. But if you just think their boards have got to sit there and they have got to repurpose or actually close huge swathes of their engineering capability. They've got to get out of what is actually what they were created and what they do. And that is a really big cultural challenge for them. And I think it's going to be very expensive, it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be politically very challenging. Because no government likes to see a factory close, even if it's a direct result of their policy. And of course, that knock-on effect will also be felt in the supply chain and the dealer network. And all this really, when you add it up, it means that the manufacturers have got a massive legacy cost that they've got to work through, which is not only financial, it's political and it's cultural. So it's big change. And what that really means is that there is a lot of opportunity for new entrants into this space. And Tesla have proved that you can do it. So the dominance that we've had of these manufacturers over many years, I think is now starting to shake. So there's a race. You've got the old players that need to redesign their offering with the new technology and deal with the legacy issues. But there's the new players that, starting from scratch, completely redesign the concept, but they've got to build capability very rapidly. So for the driver, that means that the cost of the car should come down over time. Running costs are certainly going to be much lower. But that, of course, will have a knock-on effect of profitability for the dealer groups. And again, substantial job losses could follow. Insurance costs will fall as cameras, sensors, biometric recognition, etc., makes cars harder to crash and harder to steal. But that, of course, will impact profitability and jobs in the insurance sector. So it's perhaps not so good news if you work in the legacy parts of this industry, but it does sound like it could be good news for the consumer. But like your phone, every car will be hardwired to the grid, and so will your credit card. There'll be virtually nowhere you can stay private. So cheaper cars means more cars, but that means more congestion. So flexible congestion charging to manage traffic flow, instant fines straight off your credit card for infringements like driving in bus lanes or parking on red routes, speed limits universally enforced. So next year the UK adopts the EU legislation that if you break the speed limit, there's an audible warning. Something like ode to joy, I guess. The EU has said that this is a small start to gain consumer acceptance. In a few years, I guess, Black Sabbath's Paranoid at something like volume 11 until your ears bleed, or you slow down. That's the choice that's coming in. So my fear is that there will be an inevitable and increasing intrusion into the driving experience. So I think we're witnessing a fascinating, huge change in global economy around this area. The regulation is driving massive disruption. Not all the manufacturers will survive. Some will definitely struggle along the way. And we will see new entrants coming into play. So should be gains for consumers in terms of cost, choice and safety. But I think there's consequences for jobs and I think for civil liberties. And I think the last thing, just think about the emotional pull of the car. From the mid-20th century, the internal combustion engine has been incredibly important. Thousands of films, songs about freedom of the open road and all the rest of it, but I just can't see films like Bullitt, The Blues Brothers and Easy Rider being based around the emotional pull of the Nissan Leaf. So regardless of the lower cost, practicality and carbon efficiency, it just feels to me like this is an end of an era. I can't see any bands getting rich penning a song about a Tesla, sorry. But we might just all end up listening to Highway to Hell as we silently waft along at 15 miles an hour in a low carbon zone, bored out of our minds.
Thanks, Nigel. Extra points for song titles in the questions later. Norman.
Thank you. I actually would like to take off from where Nigel just finished. I want to make a passionate defense of the pleasure of driving and what that means is for us as human beings, not about the technologies or about the energy, but why I think we need to defend this as a principle, as the principle that should inform how we should be thinking about the future of transport, because that's what we're talking about after all. I'm not fetishizing the internal combustion engine versus electricity. If the electric car can give you that experience in the future and has the technology to do that, I'm all in favor of that wonderful feeling that you get when you're in behind the wheel of a car and you put your foot on the accelerator and you sink back into it and you are in control. You are the agent. You are the subject. You might be wanting to go from point A to point B, but the wonderful thing about us as human beings is we can decide not to go to A and B. We could veer off the road. We can stray from our lanes without some haptic feedback on our telling us to get back in our lane and not go and just be instrumental about everything we do in life. Because mankind has always benefited from straying from their lanes. You know, Aristotle made the point that one of the distinguishing features of human beings was that we were self-moving, unlike rocks and other parts of it. And in fact, just think about what would have happened. Can you imagine if there would ever have been a Tesla if Adam and Eve had not been forced to leave the Garden of Eden? Moving, mobility, forcing mankind to confront nature in different forms, forced us to overcome our own biological limits in order to be able to expand, to control, to create a world that was human, not a natural world. And I fear that one of the problems in this discussion that we're having about the future of transport, and particularly about cars, and more specifically about the driverless car, is some very misanthropic discussion, which actually assumes that the problem we have to solve is human need or greed, or human infallibility, or the fact that humans sometimes stray on from the short and narrow. And I think that's a very, very dangerous starting point, because if we are the problem, where's the solution going to come from? Everybody says, I don't know, you saw this week, Valence, one of the big expert government advisors, saying we have to cut down on how much meat we eat and how much travel we do. We have all these experts telling us that we have to start limiting what we do as human beings. The point, ladies and gentlemen, I want to suggest is that we have got one resource that is not going to run out anytime soon, and that's human brain power. It's us, the human imagination, it's human ingenuity. That is a sustainable source of energy, of creativity, of knowledge, of transformation, that if we begin to create a society that looks to the future, that says we have to limit what human beings can do, we're actually fighting this war with one hand behind our backs. And I think that's a very, very dangerous position to be in. So when I look at this discussion, the problem I always have with it is that I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve. Are we trying to solve the problem of the planet, of energy? Are we trying to solve the problem of the fact that people cause accidents, that there's a cost to the health service, that perhaps jobs in the old car manufacturing system is going to disappear, what's going to replace them? All these kind of angst-ridden discussions. I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve here. I think the problem that people are not stating, but which is the underlying assumption in all of this, is that it's the human problem. It's the human footprint, it's human greed. We have to curb, we have to now start nudging people into not being as consuming as much as they did before. I'll give you an interesting thought. Human infallibility, the fact that people cause accidents, the number of road deaths. Did you know that on average in the UK there's about 1,800 deaths a year on the roads, about 30,000 people injured? This apparently, according to some auditors, Hillary will know more about this than me, the economic cost is about 36 billion a year. Big item. We need to cut this down, so we're going to have these driverless cars that will overcome that. But did you know that in the same year there's more than 6,000 deaths in the UK as a result of home accidents, which costs the economy about 45.6 billion. So the answer to this surely must be, citizens, I ask you, should we not all be more in our cars than in our homes in the future? Isn't that, I mean, if we want to save the NHS, which is what we now all have been tasked with, you save the NHS by not going to the NHS, by not putting any pressure on it. Never mind that the NHS can't do what it's supposed to do. But that seems to me is the kind of upside down. So why are we prioritizing the driverless car and the amount of money that's going into investment in order to create a computer and computing systems that are trying to emulate what we do? And we are 3 billion miles away from what the ability of computing can do compared to what the human brain does. We are so far away from doing that. In fact, if you look between the lines and all the manufacturers who are talking about driverless cars, who are putting billions into this is from Google through to Tesla, to Apple, to all these companies that always launch these big initiatives about the driverless car, they all privately admit that we are nowhere near getting the processing capacity, the sensors, the video cameras, everything that you have to put into one car to emulate what one human being can do. And not only that, the idea that we now should become passengers rather than drivers. And I'll leave you with that thought for a minute. Just think about what that means, the difference between a passenger and being a driver. One is about being passive, it's about being a child, about being childlike, being regulated as to where you go. Everything about your life is regimented. The other is to be a free agent, is to have the imagination, is to experience new things, to drive off the road and go into a village that you've not seen before, to imagine what their lives of the people might be there, which just throws light upon your own life and about your own experience. So my ending point is this. I think we need to really talk up and champion the principle, the idea of pleasure as being a source of the future for transport and individual judgment. Because I think we're moving into a world where that judgment now has been taken away from us, has been handed over to the experts. We've been told that the world is so complex that we cannot understand it as ordinary people who aren't scientists or whatever. And essentially, that our aspiration for the future should be about safety. Now, I've got statistics I can show you. Yeah, final point. Statistics that show that actually driving is a remarkably safe endeavor compared to other walks of life. And what I really am so depressed about in this discussion is the absence of of new thinking, of creativity. Why, for example, do we think the future should be about automating something like a car, which, as I think Nigel made the point, was just an incredible invention, an incredibly liberating piece of technology in the past century. Why are we thinking about that as being the ideal for the future? Why can't we imagine an entirely different system of mobility with the technologies that we have at our fingertips? Why are we being so narrow and so confined by what we exist today as being, this is the only thing we can think of for the future, that's the car or whatever? I just think that is so depressing. This technology could be used, for example, to remove humans from being the adjuncts of machines. We could have long transporters that take goods from one end of the country to the other without a driver in them. Why do we need a human being to sit in that cab? Why can't we use driverless technology to change agriculture, to etc.? There's so many things. Yeah, there's so many things we could be doing but we're not.
Sorry to cut people off, but I can see lots of people who get very excited by this debate and very interested in it. So I'm going to take a few contributions from the floor, then we'll come back to the panel. Just to warn you, this is a really high room with not great acoustics, so you do need to speak up when you say anything. So I'm going to start at the back there.
Right, so I've got my Tesla parked a little bit further on the other side of Buxton than I intended. I looked at my map, but I can say it's certainly the best car that I've ever owned and driven, and I've had some quite nice ones. I think I don't think it's going to save the planet in any way at all. I like it because it's fast, and my daughter likes it because you can make the indicators sound like farts. Which are two good reasons to occur. On range, I think I agree with the speaker. So that range anxiety and whatnot is a thing of the past, because I noticed with this car that battery life has improved at a faster rate than the amount of time that I can drive before need to stop for a pee and a cup of coffee. So now it's not a problem. I have to stop to charge. Well, I have to stop for a pee long before I would have to stop to charge the car. I think there are some concerns though around electric cars, and I think there's perhaps been a little bit of confusion about what we mean by an electric car to drive. There are electrically powered cars, and then there are software controlled cars, and they have their own separate issues. So they all the things that were raised about a car being part of the Internet of Things, and you're monitored as you're driving, and it's able to be controlled. That's mostly about the fact that it's software driven, not the electrical drivetrain. I think the main concern that I have though is the question of how do we get the power to, how do we get the electricity to power a national everybody having electric cars. Where does it come from? We're in the middle of an energy crisis.
Great question. Here?
What I'd ask of government in this regard is humility, really, and there's great cause for them to have that. There is historically 2.75 billion was spent on those those light bulbs which glowed slowly. When 2 years later LED bulbs were introduced, there's the diesel debacle, and I fear very much that the electric car innovation will be exactly part of that. Governments do not know better than markets. They're manipulating this market. It will maintain the price of electric cars higher than it need be. Early adopters always have to pay a higher price. Later people have been affected by this and effectively subsidising middle class early adopters. Also, the direction of travel is obviously towards automated cars, but there is a philosophical problem there which is intractable, which is the trolley problem. It's not possible to solve that for a machine learning unit.
What's the trolley problem?
Basically, it's an idea of a thought experiment about making the best of a bad job. So the best of the bad job in this case is one of those trolleys that went on the train tracks, and all you have is control over a point system. On one side is one fat man, and on the other side are 8 children, and you've got to decide which way the trolley goes. Now, the interesting philosophical point about that is if it's going and you are redirecting it, you're actively intervening to do it, then a lot of people would say, you know, I'm not happy with that. Because you're killing a person, you're actively killing a person. And for a machine like a car to make a decision, such as, you know, am I going to mow into this bus queue, or am I going to save the incumbents of the car, then that's the sort of decision it has to make. And most people who are in a car, that they would make those decisions on their own terms. For it to be made by a machine is a completely different matter. It's not tractable.
Good point. Here?
I was very interested to hear the comments, and I started off extremely concerned by the way everything was going, and then had my spirits lifted at the end.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your passion. I do agree that, like I say, as a technical challenge, electric cars, the grid, all that kind of stuff, it can be solved. For me, the big question is, do we want to solve it? And my biggest concern with all this in terms of government policy is the coercion factor of the 2030 ruling out of the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles. Yes, we can make electric cars better than petrol and diesel, I'm sure, but if that's the case, why do we not just allow ourselves the choice to pick those? Why do we have to force people to pick those? I don't see that there's a need for it. It's going to restrict innovation and development of other forms of transport, and governments, as we all know, are not particularly brilliant at picking winners when it comes to this thing. Not so long ago, we were all being told to buy diesel cars instead of petrol until we realised that that wasn't such a good idea, and we've now changed tack. Will the same happen with battery electric vehicles? I suspect it might.
Okay, thank you. Here.
Question to Mrs. Curry, please. To what extent do you think Mrs. Thatcher's interest in anthropogenically driven global warming was driven by its potential to break the power of the miners, because it helped make the case for nuclear?
Okay, we'll take one more and I'll come back to the panel.
Just two things really. One is currently as a country we consume about 350 terawatt hours of electricity annually. We make most of that. When we have 30 million electric cars, we will need around 2,000 terawatt hours annually. How are you going to generate that? And the other thing is, I mean, I loved the gentleman's speech at the end. I thought it was marvellous. But you're suggesting that we're going to have complete control, authoritarian society over our roads. I can assure you the children will defeat it within seconds of you inventing it.
Absolutely.
Okay, one point to the panel wants to come back on 1 point each, then we'll come out for more points. Norman, do you want to go first?
On your point about energy, I think it's a really key point, because until we solve the problem of energy, I think a lot of this is just a pipe dream, to be honest, the expense of it. You just look at the current problems that we have with gas and the rising prices of energy in the UK, and the fact that we're just not, we don't have enough nuclear power, etc. It's all very well talking about these targets, but what it means in reality is it's going to really hit us in the pocket. But most importantly, we just don't have the capacity to do it. If we had to go electric tomorrow, totally, what's going to happen? I mean, talk about getaway movies where the crooks are going to have to be searching for charging points. It's not going to be a very exciting position. And I find this quite astonishing, because with all the discussion that there is now about COP26 and the priorities and zero future, etc., when you actually look, for example, at how much money is being invested in fusion, which is the solution for the future, it's minuscule compared to, for example, the billions that's being spent on subsidizing fossil fuel energy. I can't remember who it was who made the point that the point about the electric car is that it's not an electric car, it's a coal-powered car. Because the electricity that's being generated is still being mostly generated through fossil fuels. And in fact, the batteries and everything, the production of all of these things, all you're doing is you're shifting the pollution from the cities where the cars are to the source of the production of electricity, which is mainly based on fossil fuels. So it's a misnomer, the whole discussion. I think we should just be very honest about this and say, well, the real point that we should be discussing, government, must be, what's the future of energy? That's the solution to all of these things.
Thank you. Nigel?
I'll pick up on the cost of the car. I think it's going to be quite challenging over the next 10, 15 years as there's the transition of the technologies. It's quite interesting. Every Tesla owner I know actually raves about them. If you talk to an automotive engineer, they weep. They're in terms of the manufacturing quality compared to best-in-class like Toyota, they've got a long way to go. But they will get there. The quality in terms of production process will get much better. So you've got big economies of scale to come, which means they will get cheaper. So you'll get the electric vehicles cost coming down, and certainly when the battery technology develops, and there's big leaps and bounds that we'll go through here. When we get to solid-state batteries, which is probably 3 or 4 years off, that will be they will be significantly lighter, which means you can make the whole car a lot lighter as well. So you've got another step change to come. So you've got these changes that will happen over the next 10, 15 years. But you've got the legacy manufacturers. So if we just take a big automotive plant, so the Mini that's coming out in 2 or 3 years' time, that's the last one. Audi have already said their last development in their product range is 2025. So they're in run out. So you've got a choice. You've got a great big factory that you spent a fortune on. You're just going to drive that for cash. So you know at a certain point in time it will be at the end of its life. You will not be making any more petrol Audis out of that vehicle, but you've invested all that money. You'll just be putting as much product through there as you can to get it into the market, and you're going to do that by price, because the value of your equipment is going to be zero broadly at the end of that. So you're going to have big reductions in the price of, in the cost of internal combustion engine cars as well. So there's a real sort of seesaw effect that's going to be going through this period. And I guess the big thing that is going to tip the balance is what the consumer wants, because at the end of the day, someone's got to put money down and buy the car, whether it's electric, is it a Tesla or is it a VW, or is it internal combustion engine that's on run out. And I think what you're seeing at the moment is there are a lot of advocates for Teslas, and I think the jury's out a little bit on what's happening with internal combustion engines. The thing that strikes me out of all of this is, take Mercedes. They've spent 100 years and hundreds of millions building their brand, and in 2 or 3 years they've been absolutely held under the waterline by Tesla, which is an erratically managed company at best, if we're being charitable. And I just find that incredible, the way that brand has just collapsed relatively from a new entrant.
Thanks, Nigel. Edwina?
Let me address a couple of the questions about motivation. Did Margaret Thatcher talk about climate change because she wanted to defeat the miners? She'd already trashed the miners. That was 1984. And she was making her speeches in 1988, 89. I think her motivation was that she'd sorted out Britain and she was about to sort out the world. Remember, she was a scientist as well, so she was on top of a lot of that stuff. So that's, I think, that motivation. What's our motivation worrying about car deaths more than deaths at home? Just a suggestion that actually the falling number of car deaths, they're mostly young people. Whereas accidents at home, I think you'll find are mostly older people, falls at home, that sort of thing. And as an older person, I can say I would be much more anxious to save your life than mine. And that, I think, is the way that governments often are thinking and policymakers are often thinking. It's also a question of what you can do and what you can't do. Motivation for doing all of this? Getting CO2 down if we possibly can, or at least getting our CO2 additional emissions into the atmosphere down, because CO2 itself is extremely stable. It doesn't disappear, and it's going to be a while before we can plant enough trees or carbon capture to actually reduce that. And that's the motivation, and that's the driving force. It's not about governments being difficult or bloody-minded or anything like that. Motivation for being concerned about it? Yeah, you're absolutely right. The electricity supply is what is the key to a lot of this. I do something very symbolic. My electricity supplier at home is EDF, which is nuclear and hydroelectricity. And I know it's still the same stuff coming through the wires, but the more we can do that, I've been a consistent supporter of nuclear power, and particularly now of small modular reactors. I represented people from Rolls-Royce for many years. The quicker we overcome our fear and anxiety about that, the better. And lastly, my motivation for looking forward to driverless cars, apart from the fact the car is absolutely bloody marvellous, I can tell you, you want to turn off into a field and play with yourself, that's fine, you can do it in any kind of car. But the day will come when I will sit in my car and it will say to me, "Good morning, Edwina." And I will say, "Good morning." And it will say, "Destination." And I will say, "The Trafford Centre." The Trafford Centre, confirm. And I will fold my arms over my handbag and it will drive me there far more safely than I can do it myself. And while I'm doing it, I shall listen to Bob Marley on the radio and I'll sing along. What's to hate about that?
Thank you. Right, another round of questions, please. Over there.
Thanks very much. I've just made this point as a panellist, so I'd like to ask it and get some different views now. And is that not that we're making as big a mistake now as we did with the motorways towards electric-powered cars? And that is completely underestimating the demand and the need at the end of the day that will be generated by all this in terms of electric cars. The amount of charging points, trailing leads, everywhere cluttered. I've got it now at work where my next door neighbour's got 3 charging points and I'm tiptoeing over it. Is the answer not to put the handbrake on now and say actually we need to standardise one thing on a vehicle, which is the battery, which needs to be the same size, same shape. You drive into the garage with an empty battery, you get a new battery put in a matter of seconds and you drive out, because that way it's going to benefit business, it's going to benefit salesmen, we can transfer it into HGVs, etc. And I just wonder if we're not going down a completely tragic route that actually will cause more problems than it will resolve 20 years from now.
Just following on from Norman's contributions, really, in terms of the conversation being about the future of energy, I think we can sometimes end up having a conversation about different types, or whether it's more sustainable or whatever it might be. And Amory Lovins, American intellectual who wrote the book Factor 4, he invented the hypercar, which was basically going back to first principles to make the most ergonomically, the most aerodynamic car in the world, and you could travel across America on 1 tank of petrol. But he realised that if he marketed it, then everybody would buy it, and therefore there'd be more congestion, and therefore he shelved his blueprints. So he had this fantastic idea and basically had to put it away, partly because 2 things. One is that there's a fear of more people driving that really encourages congestion. And the second one is a fear of mobility, which is possibly the same thing in a different guise. That travel today, or transportation or mobility, is very often seen as the problem. That we shouldn't fly everywhere, we shouldn't drive places, we shouldn't, we should stay home, save lives, as the old phrase goes. So if the planet, or if energy conservation is the question, then doing less is becoming the answer. I'm fundamentally opposed to this, by the way, but I think that not travelling seems to be the way it's going. When George Monbiot wrote his book Heat, he finished his opening chapter by saying, if one person reads this book, stays in bed all day, and therefore reduces their carbon footprint, then it's all been worthwhile. Okay? And then you have Patrick Balance saying, stay home, save lives, same thing, right? So suddenly we've got mobility being the problem. So this conversation is slightly arty-farty, airy-fairy, neither nor there, because actually we're going to be encouraging people not to travel, regardless of the modal shift. And maybe then only those people who can afford your 40 grand Tesla, thank you very much, are going to be the ones floating around the streets. So I think that there's a bigger problem here rather than just the technology.
Thank you. The front.
Thank you. Regarding the SMRs, the small nuclear modular reactors, I was looking at this a couple of years ago with molten salt, for example, and thorium. And these projects have been around since the 60s, and America actually built a thorium reactor, but it was no good because it wasn't part of the defence system for making plutonium for nuclear weapons. So it's all been shelved, but it's good technology. And why hasn't Rolls-Royce got onto SMRs and start making them? China is already, from its coal power stations that it's still building, it's developing these small modular reactors to replace the coal burning aspect of the power station. And they've got a couple on trial already. Now, as a technology reliant country, shouldn't we be on the forefront and the cutting edge of replacing our existing nuclear power for SMRs and thorium and thorium reactors?
Thank you. There's somebody over there. No? Okay. Over here?
I've got some technical questions as a car owner. As somebody who's never paid more than 600 quid for a car, I am somewhat concerned about the elimination of the second-hand market, and the fact that, you know, if I do buy a second-hand electric car in 6 or 7 years' time, I'll then be hit with a bill for £3,000 for a new battery to make it worthwhile. So that is a problem. So how is that problem going to be solved? And also in terms of, I mean, quite apart from the production of electricity, in terms of the future of transport more generally, people talk about, oh, what we need is better public transport, which is fine if you live in the city. But I live in a small town in Scotland now, and there just isn't going to be the demand that's going to be able to create a reasonable infrastructure that's going to be anywhere close to the convenience of a motor car. And previously I lived in a village in Scotland, and that's certainly not the case that there's going to be that kind of infrastructure. So cars are going to remain absolutely crucial to people getting around. So how do we do that? And how do we get around the myth of public transport? Because I just don't think it's going to really fly, as it were.
Yes,
I'll be behind Rob here in the queue for a second-hand car and a boiler before the deadlines. One thing about cars that I don't think the electric car will take away certain joys will be the fact that I often get lost driving. So that would destroy the pleasure of all of these places I've never expected to be in that ended up in. So, but the question I have is sort of, it's related, and it is the question about infrastructure that would support the electric car. I don't understand how that works in practice, given the age of the infrastructure of Britain and the lack of investment. Because Rob mentions the fact about the points of supporting the countryside, but the reality at a place like Nottingham is, as far as I can tell from the stats, it's got one of the lowest car usage, and I think that's to do with poverty, and it's not to do with the fact that people have got loads of money, and therefore it actually concerns me that what the city is doing, which ironically is all out for carbon neutral, and has the lowest air pollution in the country, is hell for leather going for the sort of reducing as many cars in the city as possible. Yet the reality is the cities contain the majority of the population. The cities contain families. Cities contain families who need to ferry their children around. It's the place where people, if they want to go out and they need to go to the supermarket to get cheap food, or they want to go and they need to do their DIY. So there does seem to be a bit of a reality gap in the whole discussion about electric cars and the infrastructure, which is there's huge swathes of the population that are going to be excluded from this discussion, that don't have the money and live in small terraced housing in busy cities, and this isn't going to serve their purposes. It doesn't all add up to me.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to come back to the panel, and then I know there's still people want to speak, so we'll come out to you again for one final round of questions. Nigel.
Yeah, I'll just pick on Rob's point about the used market. So we've got innovation now in new electric vehicles driven by regulation. If the purpose of that regulation is for climate change and all the rest of it, it seems to me that you would want to push that regulation right down the chain. So let's really think about how we can make it as green as possible. And of course, that kicks into the used market and the whole life cycle. You know, for all the engineering that's gone into vehicles over the last 50, 60 years, they still only last about 10 or 12 years. Well, there's a reason for that, because the obsolescence is built in. It gets to a point where it's just not economic to keep them on the road, apart from if you're at the £600 banger market, but I'm putting that as a yeah. So what you could do is use regulation to make sure that the cars are fixable and recyclable, and the platform lasts for 20, 30 years, and you just swap out the bits that need swapping out and putting back in. So you keep the back, because at the end of the day, the greenest car is the one you've got, not the one you're going to buy that's got to be made, and that sometimes gets lost in the debate here. But this is where is regulation going to drive innovation, or is it going to drive protectionism? Will the German government really want to start looking at making cars, forcing the manufacturers to make cars for 30 years, when VW, Mercedes, BMW and all those big manufacturers that are based in Germany are already looking at a big hit in terms of jobs and tax paid and all the rest of it? Or will they just step back and keep the existing 10, 12-year cycle going? I suspect they might do that, but I think that would be the wrong move.
Edwina?
I think there's, in answer to your question, I think there's going to be a variety of different ways of doing the charging of vehicles. And there are some ways that haven't been properly established yet. I mean, a very obvious one would be induction charging. You know, the way you charge your electric toothbrush, it actually rests on a base, and there's no actual connection, physical connection. And that might be something that we do by putting lines through roads so buses start charging the moment. There's all sorts of, you're the engineer, you know, there's all sorts of different ways of doing this. And then you won't have quite so many wires. The problem that comes up for people in terrace housing and inner cities is there's nowhere to put the wires. And yet, you know, that description of concentrated populations in cities, that's a classic for a mass public transport system. They were the ones that are going to make a mass transit system viable, whereas, you know what, in Derbyshire, it ain't. There's only one way it's going to run here, like in Scotland, is if it's heavily subsidised by, well, the taxes on Teslas, if you like. When it comes to, what else is it? Standards of living and travel. And the argument about how travel is seen as a negative, not a public good, but a public problem. A lot of that is about a kind of a downward looking, a downside looking at the way we live and our standards of living. And actually, the way we live and the standards of living is very largely up to us in a free society. We can decide that far more than they could in North Korea or China, and it's up to us, and I think that's a good thing. If you choose to travel and be blessed. What I'm interested in public policy terms is, please don't leave a lot of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere, because that's going to give me and my family and my children, my grandchildren, a real problem. I think the travel is possible with far less carbon dioxide, far less greenhouse gases going up there, and electricity is part of the answer, not the whole answer.
Norman?
Well, the problem is that the public policy at the moment is the exact opposite. The public policy is, as was said at the back, is don't drive, stay at home.
No, that's not public
policy. It is. Admitting you don't live in London, I live in London. Come to London now and see what the low traffic neighbourhoods has done to congestion in London. Just see what it's done.
But it's ultra low emissions.
No, it's not. It's not. They have changed the infrastructure.
Okay, let's not let this descend into...
Right, let's all shout at once. So I think, you know, we've got to call a spade a spade. The future of mobility, as far as the people who are running our society today are concerned, is stay at home. That's the future. And all this other stuff is just bump. It's all just, you know, it's window dressing, in my opinion. You know, Edwina, I look forward to the day when I get into my automated car, if it's ever is realised, and it says, "Good morning, Norman. Where would you like to go today?" And I say, "Well, I'd like to go to Trafford Centre." And my car says to me, "Is your journey necessary?" And I have to have an argument.
But what you say, but your answer is...
I have to have an argument with
but your answer is yes.
I have an argument. I then engage in a conversation with a machine which has no ability to follow any human judgment, but it can only follow the laws of physics. And I'm then it's like I'm talking to a 3-year-old, and I'm trying to convince a 3-year-old about, you know, why my journey is important. Then I want to put on Bob Marley, and it says to me, well, Bob Marley made records at a time when they used plastic, and what it did to the environment was just terrible.
Just to make an argument.
But let me just enlighten you on another thing. I went in an autonomous vehicle today. I caught a train from London to Macclesfield. I got on the train and he said good morning to me, and I said, good morning. He said, where would you like to go? I said, I'd like to go to Macclesfield, please. So I sat back, and between I can't remember, it was for one point that we were travelling at 5 miles an hour because some train had broken down or a signal had gone. A signal, right? So think of the future where we're going to have driverless cars, where we haven't got the infrastructure, where there's no signals, where there's no electricity. This is just nonsense, frankly. I just think we've got to get real and really stand back from this discussion and not get involved and just see it as a technical issue. This is a very fundamentally social, political, ideological and cultural issue. And it's really at the very heart of it is, what kind of society do we want to live in as human beings? Not as protectors of the planet, not as nature, but in terms of how we can sustain life, a better life for all, without destroying the planet, obviously.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back out to the audience, probably your last chance. So let me see everybody who wants to speak, and let's make sure we get you all in. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is that everybody? 7. Go.
I was an activist during the last general election for the Blue Party. Okay? I walked the streets in northwest Durham, and I obviously understood the communist, I was going to say the communist, that's what we are now, the Conservative Manifesto, and all the data that came from CCHQ, none of this was mentioned. Can you imagine the dressing down I would have got on the doorstep of a pit village in northwest Durham bringing this up? We didn't vote for this, it wasn't on the ballot paper, and it's way out of line. I voted for Boris Johnson, not Carrie.
One of the things I wanted to just make is, we're all different in here. We all live different lives. We all live in different places.
Absolutely.
As a child, I lived just on the outskirts of Nottingham. My dad used to cycle the 1.5 miles to work, cycle back at lunchtime and so on. He lived and worked near his community. My mum at 96 was still living 5 miles from the centre of Nottingham, independently, and every day she travelled into Nottingham because there was a bloody good bus service. And she could sit at the bus stop and talk to people and get on the bus and talk to people and so on. Meanwhile, when I was working, I was driving 45 minutes into work, I was driving back 45 minutes, often sat in traffic jams. And it wasn't until I retired that I thought, why did I waste so much time doing that? And so when the gentleman over there said about the government policy is stay at home, I disagree with you in actual fact. There is almost a feeling amongst many people that they want to stay within their community, and if they can work from home and not spend 45 minutes travelling here or there, they would like that opportunity. And sometimes they would like to go into work because they do want to meet their colleagues, they do want to sometimes have meetings of the team. But if it's possible to work at home, they're quite happy to work at home, and they won't be locked in their home. They might take their kids to school and then go back and work. And then maybe it's 11 o'clock, they'll go to a cafe. I'm living in now a large village, small town. They'll go to the cafe. They'll come back home. They'll pick the kids up maybe. Maybe they'll be working at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night because the kids have gone to bed and so on. But they're leading a totally different life to me, but I talk to them because I see them in the cafes and so on. What I would just like to say finally is, I sensed a whole load of paranoia this morning. I really did. And I thought, you are not living in my world. You're not living in the world of 80% of the population. A lot of people do not feel oppressed. But they are pissed off with COVID. That's happening. And so I would just like to say, let's remember the variety of people, the variety of journeys, the variety of environments, and enjoy life.
Okay, who was 3 there?
Yeah, I was wondering if we dismissed e-bikes too easily. Because e-bikes, so we talked about them about 30 seconds, but you could do simple things like increasing the speed restrictions to, say, 20 miles an hour. then you're increasing the range, even in country areas where you can get to public transport. So you're 20 miles from Buxton, you can do that in an hour, or 10 miles in half an hour. So, and you've also got the benefits of things like every bike on a road is one less car, which is less traffic, less pollution, better power to weight ratio in terms of using energy because they're lighter. So you can invest in carbon technologies and things like that, and obesity, and health outcomes as well.
Thank you. Behind you.
What I want to say is it seems to be quite a strange amount of pessimism and fatalism going on in this room in relation to electric cars, especially Norman's comments. It seems to be kind of pitting human ingenuity and the agency of the human brain against electric cars. To me, electric cars and future of autonomous vehicles is representing our ability to be ingenuitive and give us possibilities as agents, as Edwina mentioned. Some people would like the opportunity to go to the pub, for example, and then be driven home by their car. That's an option possibly available to us in the future. That's more choice, perhaps, you can see, than you all seem to be offering. And again, you also spoke as if we're on one path to only electric or autonomous vehicles. There's loads of new ingenuity going on in how we move around cities. E-scooters, e-bikes, you've mentioned, those strange sort of Segway things. If you could walk out into Manchester, people are moving around in many different ways than they were 20 years ago. So I just don't see this kind of pessimistic vision to being driven in prisons around no choice. That's simply not how it's going to go.
Okay, thank you. Ian?
I'm speaking as a motorcyclist. So I'm interested in the last two comments about e-scooters and e-bikes. My view is that solution's been available for over 150 years. It's called a motorcycle. It is less congesting, it's less polluted, and it's a great way of getting around. But it's not always the right choice for every journey, and I think that's part of what we've got to look at here, is that there needs to be a broad range of choice. We don't want the options restricted, we want them broad. Like I say, Edwina may look forward to the day where she can sit in a box and ask it where she wants to be delivered to. For me, going out on a motorcycle, I intentionally go out to get lost. So there's a whole different reason why I'm actually out there on the road.
Great. Okay, somebody over there. Oh, there, sorry, yes.
Yeah, I just like to say, I was in London recently and I cycled around, and I used to live in London, I like travelling around into London. And it's been absolutely transformed, how you can use a bike now. I mean, so many more cyclists. They take up far more less space. We have such a fixation on private car ownership. I mean, I have my own private car, I live in the countryside. But, we should be looking at options for communal car ownership, and get away from this fixation with private car ownership that just clogs the place up so much.
Okay.
Most cars spend 95% of their time sat in people's driveways.
Good challenge. Thank you. Final comment.
I think the energy question is a bit of a red herring, really, because I would suggest that perhaps the agenda that is being played out here is not about a switch from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars. I don't think the goal is to replace all the petrol and diesel cars that are in the country right now with electric cars. I would suggest that perhaps the agenda is to limit mobility, as this gentleman here said, and actually go towards autonomous vehicles where nobody owns a private car.
Okay. Right, thank you for all your contributions. We're going to go to the panel now. About a minute each, please. Edwina.
Oh, just quickly, the reason we didn't talk about e-bikes is that the topic is cars. It's as simple as that. And you have to bear in mind the very diverse population that we have. I used to ride bikes in Russia and Poland and all over the place. But that was then. And now, to be on a bike of any kind on our twisty, turny, quite dangerous roads in the Peak District, and they're very dangerous for motorbikes, is just too dangerous. It's not something I'm going to risk. I like being in my little cage. I tell you what, I love the idea of being driven to, not a pub, but a decent restaurant and being able to down a whole bottle of wine, get in the car and be driven home safely. I think that's brilliant. There are all sorts of aspects to this. It's not a question, in my humble view, of paranoia versus... Or I've heard Armageddon several times in debates today. And I think that's probably some of the downside of COVID and our anxieties and all the fears that have been generated. With a bit of luck, the sun shines outside. And we should look forward with some optimism to the future. And I think the future is going to be cars without carbon dioxide and different ways of doing it. Probably the bulk of them being electric cars. And I only wish I'd bought Tesla shares when they were $17 each, which I didn't.
Thank you. Nigel.
Yeah, just picking up a couple of points here. I think we're at the start of something here. We have spoken about cars, but you're absolutely right. It's actually the whole spectrum of transport. There is a huge amount of innovation because a lot of, back to this disruptive idea, a lot of the existing manufacturers are doing what they're doing, but the new entrants coming in looking at it completely differently. So you've got something like GoCycle, which is an electric bike designed by, I think, a Williams F1 technician. It's about $5,000. He's using state-of-the-art materials. The electric motor is absolutely cutting edge and all the rest of it. You can't get them, even at that price for an electric bicycle. Where does that blur into a motorcycle? You've got BMW putting out some fantastic concept vehicles now. The latest one looks like a BMX bike, but actually is a motorcycle. So these edges are blurring. Then you've got the scooters as well. So I think the exciting thing for me about all of this is people are taking this technology and are playing with it and thinking of different ways to doing it. We've kind of got stuck a little bit in the electric car thing here, but actually there's a whole ton of stuff that could be coming. Bikes, motorcycles, three-wheelers, a lot more weather protection, so you use that to commute. So there's an awful lot I think will come out over the next 5 years.
Jetpacks?
Well, that may be a bit far.
No.
I love e-bikes, as it happens. I have one. And I use it, and I cycle in the mountains of northern Lombardy. And it's fantastic. I feel like a young man again. And I can keep up with younger riders because I can't do that. So I've absolutely no problem with that whatsoever. The problem really is, what problem are we solving with all of this discussion? That's what I tried to begin with at the start. So, again, we have this example of, I'd love to be able to just call up a car, go to a restaurant, have a bottle of wine, get sloshed, have a great time, and then just get driven home. We do that already, right? It's called Uber. In the past, we had a service in London where the guy used to come, you would drive to a restaurant, get sloshed, and he'd come and put on a little scooter and put his scooter in your boot and then drive you home in your car. There was a service in London. Now, why do we need electric cars or autonomous vehicles to do that? What problem are we solving here? That's really what I'm really driving at, excuse the pun, is I'm a great advocate of innovation, but technological innovation, particularly where we have unexpected outcomes. And the unexpected outcomes are always the way human beings adopt technologies that are designed for one thing and they transform them into something else. The problem I fear today is that all our innovation is already geared towards something that we know what the outcome is. We want the expected outcome. The range for the possibility of future choices is that there should be unexpected stuff. And what we're trying to do, I think, as a society, the direction we're going in, is that we want everything to be reliable, predictable, boring, stay in your lanes. And I think that's a problem.
Thank you. Thanks to our panel.